Hello, and welcome to One-on-One with Robert Doar. I'm your host, Robert Doar, and thanks for tuning in today. As president of the American Enterprise Institute, I have the unique privilege of working with America's greatest policy experts. These scholars focus on policy issues in the fields of education, economics, energy, foreign and defense, and so much more. Subscribe to this podcast for exclusive access to in-depth discussions on the most pressing policy issues. Together with my guests, we'll challenge political preconceptions, explore innovative ideas, and create, I hope, a freer and safer world. Joining us today is Ken Pollack, a senior fellow in foreign and defense policy studies. Ken has been here for now 7 or 8 years. And doing outstanding work, focuses a lot on the Middle East, I think mostly on the Middle East. Right. And the Middle East is on fire right now. And so we're going to ask him questions about that. Welcome, Ken.
Thanks so much for having me, Robert.
So let's start with Hamas and Israel. Brutal, unprovoked invasion by Hamas. Israel is now in the process of responding. Maybe you just give us a sense of how did that happen and what's your view of the current state of events?
Well, obviously, it's the Arab-Israeli conflict. We can go back all the way to about, the first millennia BCE, if you really want to start on where this began. We can also bring it forward and say it began in the 1920s, or we can bring it right up to much more recent days, and that's probably the easiest place to start, where in recent years what we had was kind of an uneasy balance between Hamas's rule in Gaza and Israel's relationship with Hamas. And it's worth remembering, 2005, Ariel Sharon, then the prime minister of Israel, pulls all Israeli troops out of Gaza, gives it up, also pulls a number of settlements out of Gaza. So Gaza is not occupied by Israel after 2005. And there are elections in Gaza. The United States pushes them forward, despite the fact that any number of people tell the United States not to do this, because if they hold elections there, Hamas is going to win. We hold elections in Gaza, or in the Palestinian Authority entirely. Gaza goes entirely to Hamas. And so Hamas becomes the government there. And it's an uneasy relationship. But what we saw was that in recent years, the Israeli government, mostly led by Prime Minister Netanyahu, made a Faustian deal with Hamas, more or less allowed it to run things in Gaza, and agreed to allow very considerable amounts of aid to flow into Gaza. Aid from various Arab states, aid from the international community, even from the West, going into Gaza for, ostensibly humanitarian relief efforts and reconstruction, development, etc., in reality going straight into Hamas's coffers. And everyone knew this. And Hamas was using it to enrich their leaders and using it to build tunnels and buy weapons and prepare themselves, it turns out, for this big attack on October 7th. But that was the theory. The theory that Netanyahu and his people had was, listen, if we allow Hamas to rule Gaza, and we give it all this money, allow all this money to flow in, right, they will be fat and happy, and they'll leave us alone.
Okay, so I want to question you on a couple of the details that you mentioned there. The first thing you said was the Arab-Israeli conflict. Why didn't you say the Palestinian-Israeli conflict?
Well, because the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is ultimately part of this larger problem of the Arab-Israeli conflict.
But aren't large portions of the Arab world reconciling to the state of Israel while the Palestinians are not?
Absolutely. But it's still not a done deal. You're right that is the direction that everything is moving in. And, we may in some ways have a resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict before we have a resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Well, an argument could be made that Hamas invaded Israel to disrupt the reconciliation of the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Yes, and I would agree with that. Absolutely. So again, this is the issue out there, and again, it's been one of the reasons I use this term is because you really can't separate the Palestinian-Israeli conflict from the Arab-Israeli conflict. We have been trying to do so. The Israelis have been trying to do so. Various Arab states have been trying to do so. But, it's why when you work on the Middle East, you hear people using that famous line from The Godfather over and over again, Michael Corleone saying, "Every time I think I'm out, they pull me back in."
Yeah, okay, I get that. But let's go back to the second thing you said, is that this gift. I sometimes refer to Gaza as a gift, the Israeli gift to the Palestinians. Okay, you wouldn't settle, you wouldn't make a deal with Clinton. We had all kinds of opportunities to work this out, but still, we're going to give you Gaza. We're going to pull our settlers out. That was an emotional thing for the Israelis to do.
No question.
And you can have self-government and you can rule yourself in Gaza. And then you threw in that little slap at the United States, but leave them out for a second. It's not the United States' fault that the Palestinians chose Hamas. Is that right?
Absolutely. At the end of the day, the Palestinians chose Hamas. They chose it for a whole variety of reasons, most of them bad.
And isn't it also true that in the wake of the invasion on October 7th, people did polling data, and do you trust this polling data, and found that 70% of the Palestinians, even after knowing what Hamas had done in Israel, supported their action?
Yeah, it's not hard to believe. First, the polling sources are pretty reputable, and I've been doing this work for a very long time, and this does seem to reflect Palestinian opinion. It's been very consistent, so there's no reason to doubt it. It is, of course, worth noting that whenever polling has been done, including after October 7th, regarding Palestinian views of Hamas as their government, then Hamas scores really low. Palestinians do not like Hamas as the government. They see Hamas as corrupt, as utterly self-centered, as bringing all kinds of problems down upon them. They do not want Hamas as their government. And again, both are worth thinking about. Both are worth understanding.
So one last thing about the Arab-Israeli conflict and the two-state solution and the fate of the Palestinians. In an article recently that was in the Wall Street Journal, the historian Benny Morris was talking about how he's come to see this world, and it's a pretty. I think he was a kind of a man of the left and was trying to be understanding of Palestinians for a long period, but now he's had it. He's done. So after all these efforts to make a fair settlement, and the Palestinians keep walking away, or their leadership does. He refers to all of Arabia as being available to the Palestinians. Is that true?
Well, in the most technical sense, no, it's not, because the other peoples of Arabia don't necessarily want the Palestinians. They've certainly been willing to accommodate some Palestinians. So there are Palestinians in Saudi Arabia, in the Gulf states, who come to work, and they bring their families with them. But the fact of the matter is that most of the Arab countries have tried very hard to limit the numbers of Palestinian refugees and Palestinian immigrants, because the fact of the matter is Palestinian refugees have created problems in many important Arab countries. They caused a civil war in Jordan in 1970, which we call Black September. They triggered the civil war in Lebanon in 1975. They created problems in Egypt. So most of the Arab states don't want more Palestinians.
So just in terms of, let's think of this in terms of a migration policy discussion. Are you telling me that a lower middle class Palestinian family is not able to move to Egypt or Jordan or Saudi Arabia or somewhere else in the Arab world and settle down the way millions of people all over the world move to new countries and start out?
It's not impossible by any stroke, but it's also not easy. Because, again, none of these countries want more Palestinians. And when they bring them in because they have specific skills.
I should also say the United States, by the way. Right. Palestinians come to the United States and have.
Yes, absolutely.
And have settled successfully.
But, most of what you're talking about, most of the kind of lower middle class Palestinians, they want to remain where they are, or in many cases they have these fantasies of being able to get their ancestral homes back as well. But
how many generations?
At this point in time, you can be talking about 2, you can be talking about 3 or 4.
What percentage of the Palestinian population in Gaza ever lived in Palestine?
I don't know. I just don't have those numbers, truth be told.
So let's go back to the reaction. Israel has treated the Hamas invasion as a Pearl Harbor type invasion, and they are committing war on Gaza and on Hamas.
Right.
Is that justified?
Well, certainly it is an act of self-defense. I think there's no question it is justified in that sense. To me, you use the Pearl Harbor analogy. I think that's a perfect analogy. I think that what we did after 9/11 is also a perfect analogy. Hamas's relationship to the Palestinian population does remind me very much of the Japanese military's relationship to the Japanese population in the late 1930s.
So, that's the analogy. Israel is committing an act of self-defense.
Correct.
And where does it end? How do you feel about efforts on the part of the United States spokesman for another view to restrain Israel or to stop Israel from committing what it's doing in Gaza?
So I think the Japan analogy here is actually a useful one because it's a nice way of thinking about the end state. We're not going to have a Battleship Missouri moment. Right? That's part of the problem, is there won't be a Battleship Missouri moment. That said, it is entirely understandable that Israel wants to obliterate Hamas's capacity to mount another October 7th, just as the United States was absolutely determined to obliterate the Japanese military's ability to mount a second Pearl Harbor. Right? So that it has very much in common. The difference is that Hamas is a very different entity in this sense than the Japanese military was. It is outside of the Palestinian people. Like the Japanese military, it was willing to sacrifice its population. So it does have that in common. But it doesn't recognize defeat. It is not necessarily territorial. It will try to hold on to as much of Gaza as it can. But if it's evicted from Gaza, it will try to reconstitute itself outside it. And it's why I think everyone has rightly focused on this question of what does the day after look like in Gaza? Because in one of these, in a situation like this, what's critical is building a new society in Gaza that is going to reject Hamas. That's the only way that you end Hamas, is if the Palestinians in Gaza say, we don't need these people, we never liked these people, and we can now resist them, prevent them from coming back, and we want to do so because we have something better. That's the key about the day after. And it's why you're now hearing a lot of Israeli military personnel coming out publicly and saying the way that the Netanyahu government is handling things and the absence of planning for that day after are going to undermine all of the work that our military is doing so far.
But why doesn't a day after have to begin with an unconditional surrender?
It would be nice to have, and it would be nice for Hamas to have done that already. But I think that my particular view, and I think the view of most people, is you're not going to get that. As I said, Hamas is different from the Japanese military in that sense, in that Hamas probably will never stop fighting. They will never formally surrender. They will, like other terrorist groups, just fade away over time. They will fade into irrelevance. That's how these terrorist groups typically end. The question is, how do you get there? You get there by eliminating their public support. Right? Mao Zedong famously said that the gorilla is a fish that swims in the sea of the people. And if the sea turns against the fish, it's dead. Right? And that's what you ultimately have to do. And again, I think that it's entirely...
Is Israel making progress in getting the Palestinians to turn on Hamas?
Does not seem to be that case. Not at all. Right? And again, I think that's why any number of people, including increasingly voices within Israel, are pointing out that this is the great failure of Israel's strategy. That tactically, yes, they're doing a tremendous amount of damage to Hamas, but strategically, they have not yet put in place any kind of a plan that suggests that Hamas will not be able to reconstitute itself.
But their view is that the only way to put in a plan that would make it so that Hamas could not reconstitute itself is by destroying Hamas.
It certainly starts with that, but the point is it can't end with it. All through our own wars in the Middle East, we endlessly intone this, there's no military solution to this problem. There has to be a political solution. First of all, that always understated the fact that while military victory was not sufficient, it was absolutely necessary. Right? And again, as you're pointing out, I completely agree with, there has to be a military victory over Hamas, but that's not going to be sufficient.
And I would also just point out, the hostages are still being held.
Yes, many of them.
And again, this to me, the burden of the casualties that are taking place in Gaza, which are awful, is entirely being put on the Israelis, when the responsibility for continuing is also resides with Hamas, who's refused to surrender and refused to release the hostages.
No question. In fact, we can both be quite critical of the Biden administration, but let's give some credit. Tony Blinken famously was being hectored about getting Israel to stop. And he's, famously kind of got very angry and said, you want this to stop? Well, this could stop tomorrow. Hamas surrenders, hands over the hostages, and disarms. End of story.
Well, see, that's what I've been saying. Yeah, I didn't know that. Look at that.
He's right. You're right.
Yeah,
and it's critically important to always recognize who started this and who could end this immediately. Right? And everyone else would be happy.
Okay, so let's just now turn to the rest of Arabia for a moment. Some of those countries in the Arab world have more money than God. Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, they have resources. People in the United States of great power and wealth are flocking over there to get them to help us. So what I don't understand, and what I've never understood, is why don't they assert more leadership in for instance, maybe they should be responsible for the government of Gaza when it's over. Is that something that's possible?
So there's certainly a lot there to work with, but some important buts. One, they've never wanted to in the past, and they've gotten away with it. Right? There's an old joke, very, very old, that the government of Kuwait had decided to go to war with Iraq, and South Korea got the contract. Right? And that's the point, is they didn't do things themselves. They hired other people to do the jobs for them. And that is a long-standing problem. And let's recognize that there is a growing recognition, certainly within the last decade or so, a recognition that they can't simply free ride and expect to pay other people to do their work for them, that they're going to have to do this stuff themselves increasingly. And you've got countries like the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia who are trying to step up, but they just don't have the experience to do so. And they don't have the cadre of personnel. They're trying to build it. In some cases, very deliberately, they're trying to build it, but they literally don't have the people. They don't really have the experience. And you can think a little bit about America's own experience coming into the international community in the first half of the 20th century. We, too, really didn't have the people. We didn't have the muscle memory. We didn't have the institutions to do it. We had to build all that. Right? And it takes the experience of the two world wars to build all of those organizations, to educate all of those people. Right? We go from a State Department that it's a quiet, sleepy little organization to a massive, sprawling thing that can help shape the world.
Yeah, that analogy, I don't know about that. I get what you're referring to about the United States sort of in between the wars and before World War I as being ill-prepared for world leadership and had to learn all of that. But by the time the end of World War II came along, we and the United Kingdom and France and were able to partition Germany and negotiate with Russia and achieve a settlement and manage the...
Not a good one.
Well, no, but it was peaceful.
Yeah, because our armies controlled half the continent and we had nuclear weapons.
Well, I know, but it was across the Atlantic. It was a long way for us.
And again, militarily, we did fine. But remember, it takes the National Security Act of 1947 to put in place all those institutions. And again, what I'm saying is those institutions don't yet exist, or they're only being built. Right? And it takes some time for countries to do that sort of thing. And
but
we're starting
Saudi
to see
Arabia
it.
wants the world to think of itself as a sophisticated, major, modern country.
Yes, absolutely. Wouldn't you?
Yeah, well, I would think they would too. So assert a little leadership here.
Again, I think that you're seeing that happen, but it's happening slowly. And of course, we also have to recognize we see this a lot with the United Arab Emirates. Once they start asserting leadership, they may not decide to lead where we want them to lead. Right? As the United Arab Emirates built some military capabilities in the last 10 or 15 years, which I've written about, and we were all in favor of it, right? Because this is burden sharing, and they were now going to be able to do some things that we wanted them to do so that we wouldn't have to do it. And then they started doing things in places like Libya and the Horn of Africa and Yemen that we didn't like. Right, and it was kind of a how dare they? Right, they're supposed to build these capabilities.
So you're saying be careful what you ask for.
Exactly.
But the problem with be careful what you ask for attitude is that then it all falls back on us in the United States.
Well, to some extent, and I think it's fair. And I think what we have to recognize is it can never be all or nothing. Right? We don't necessarily have to lift the 100% military and diplomatic burden for the Middle East, but we also can't go to zero. Right? And that's been part of our problem is I'm not the first person to point out that the United States has a bad habit of swinging between both ends of the pendulum and rarely ever just staying at the center. Right? We need to recognize that building these capabilities, encouraging these countries to build these capabilities and show some independence is a good thing. But that doesn't mean we can walk away. And if we walk away, they are going to start taking actions we're not going to like.
Okay, now I want to ask about Israel and the rest of the world and the role of Russia in the Middle East for a minute. One of the more, I would say, and you would say, Robert, you're letting your emotions get the best of you, but one of the more heartbreaking aspects of the last 3 years has been Israel's reluctance to be very supportive of Ukraine. And the rationale, I think, that you and others would say, well, was because that they had to be careful because Russia plays such a big role in their neighborhood. But now they've seen, what evil is, and Russia's clearly not on the side of Israel in the war in Gaza, and is there any hope that where is Israel going to end? I sometimes worry that they're becoming just an independent state all to themselves, unaligned, because the United States makes them mad and they feel disconnected with the United States because we do things that irritate them. But what's going to happen? Are they going to join the countries that oppose this global problem of Iran, Russia, China, and terrorists? Or are they going to say, no, we got our little problem here, we're going to just focus on this?
So I think the easiest answer, clearest answer, most correct answer is they will very much be opposed to, yes, this emergent Iran, Russia, China, North Korea axis because of their enmity with Iran, which, by the way, just point out, is entirely on Iran, right? Israel regards Iran as its natural ally, and there's a lot to that, and tried to be friendly with Iran for decades. This is entirely on the Iranian regime, but it's unavoidable, and the Israelis have recognized that. And I think the events since October 7th have very much reinforced that. But the other side that you mentioned is also absolutely true for them, Robert, and it goes back to the last point that I made, which is that the more that the United States walks away from the Middle East and says, you guys figure it all out yourselves, you guys defend yourselves, well, if that's going to be our attitude, yeah, they're going to figure out how to defend themselves. And I think, unfortunately, October 7th has really driven that home to the Israelis. They once again feel the way that they did before 1973. Which was, we cannot count on anyone but ourselves. And therefore, we will simply have to do what we need to do to defend ourselves. Now, I think that they will continue to develop the relationship with the other Arab states because they share the enmity with Iran. And I think they will remain very open to closer relations with the United States. And of course, I thought Biden did great initially because he used the old Clinton playbook, which is if you want to influence Israel, you have to absolutely hug them. You have to be 100% behind them. That is the only way to influence them. And I think as we're seeing, that was absolutely correct, because once you start convincing the Israelis that you're no longer on their side, again, their attitude is then we will do what we have to do to defend ourselves, which often isn't what we or even they want in the long run.
So let's talk about the Biden experience here. Started out, in your judgment, great, following that playbook. Since then, not so great. What is driving that? And just talk to me a little bit about your sense of the unity in the Democratic Party on this.
I think that what drove things initially for President Biden were his own innate beliefs formed over 40, 50 years in politics. I know Joe Biden a little bit. I can't say he's a close friend, but I've actually spoken to him at length on a variety of different occasions, spent a fair amount of time with him. His sentiment for Israel, his friendship toward Israel, his sympathy for Israel, I think is absolutely genuine. And I think that's what you saw.
Very consistent with the old Democratic Party.
Exactly.
Which he's used to be a member of.
Exactly.
Yeah.
As you point out, though, we're seeing these real rifts develop within the Democratic Party, and Israel is part of it. And it is about a whole variety of things. It is about the progressive left and kind of, woke ideas about culture and society and their feelings about the United States itself. And I think that there are very important elements of anti-Semitism in there as well, warring with that older democratic policy and the kind of more centrist democratic policies, which are still there, right, and have not gone entirely as well. But the party can't find itself. And I have not spoken to President Biden since October 7th, and even before then. I don't know exactly what's on his mind. I'm not sure he'd say it even if he did. But I do think that the domestic politics is playing a huge element in this, and I think it's a huge mistake. I think that it will fail internationally. And as a student and a close reader of the work of our own scholars here at AEI, led by people like Rui Teixeira, I think that it is going to backfire for Biden politically as well. I don't think he's going to get any credit for what he's doing in terms of the domestic politics. I think that he is going to alienate huge numbers of moderate swing voters. And simultaneously, I think that he is badly undermining his own credibility and leverage with the Israelis. To me, he is casting himself in a very bad way as kind of the sort of the old Aesop's fable about the man with the son and the donkey. And the moral, of course, is when you try to please everyone, you please no one.
So, okay, last question, because you raised it a little bit, and also because I may have this wrong about you, Ken, but I suspect that you're kind of you worked in the Clinton National Security Council. You're probably Ivy League educated, sort of a charter member of the Northeast Intelligentsia, and a proud member of that community. Tell me, were you surprised by, and where does it come from, this apparent anti-Semitism among students at elite universities in the United States?
So I will say that I was shocked but not surprised by it. I think that we've been seeing this drift in academia. And let's understand, it's not just the university academia, right? It's academia at all levels. It's basic education. I have a son who's a freshman in college, right? And so I saw how he was being educated and in many ways was just appalled at it.
But what are you speaking to the sort of social justice mantra, the of color, poorer is good and must be supported, and if you're white and rich and all that also, so Israel is no longer on the side of the social justice warriors because they're an oppressor. Is that what you mean? That's been driven? That's
part of it. Part of it is also the absence of any teaching of civics, the the method and the subject matter of the teaching of history, right? What gets taught about American history, what gets taught about world history, about European history, right? It is very much shot through all of it is so much of this idea that the United States is somehow wrong, evil, what it has done in the world.
So
you're saying
that the selection of faculty members of the departments that study the Middle East, you could have seen they made bad choices in their faculty members for years.
Not just the Middle East, though. As I said, going back to secondary and primary school, elementary school.
All right.
It's just, and again, these aren't bad people. This is simply what the curricula that they're being provided and the teaching methods that they're being taught. Right. This is what they're being taught. How to teach our kids from the earliest ages. And I think that it leads inevitably to this moment in time where, yes, you've got people who, to me, it's just kind of appalling that. You've got people saying that what Israel is doing in Gaza is genocide. And it's one of those like, do you even understand what the word genocide means? How can you possibly, and do you understand the history enough to understand the tragic irony of making that claim, and then also to understand why it is that Israel's enemies have been working so diligently for decades to try to pin these labels on them, right? And we now have entire swaths of society and the best educated swaths of society who now buy this hook, line, and sinker. And again, just factually completely incorrect.
Yeah, it's a sad state of affairs. How do we let that happen? It's just unbelievable to me. Again, I am also a charter member of the North End. I wouldn't say intelligentsia, but certainly of the elite population. I went to fancy private schools in Brooklyn, and I went to fancy prep school, and I went to fancy college. But I didn't get that. I got a love for Israel and respect for Israel and understanding of Israel's place in the world and need for being a homeland for the Jewish people. But somehow happened after I left. I just don't get it.
It's been in the last 20 or 30 years. And I teach at Georgetown, I teach in a variety of places, and I'm just always so struck. And again, my son, his friends, I'm just struck by how little they've been taught, how badly they've been educated about just kind of basic factual knowledge about the world, right? And I think it is really coming home to roost. Many of my students at Georgetown, especially my undergrads, God bless them, they do come with an open mind, but they also understand that to some extent they're a blank slate. They just don't know the history.
Okay, that's a role for AEI to play. Let's teach the history, and we'll continue to do that with Ken Pollack and many others. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, listeners, and see you next time.